Hello, and welcome to another brief lecture on presidency. So you just watched, in theory, the crash course video on presidential powers. And they did a really good job of sort of laying out all the different powers of the president, and in particular the informal powers, but how those are related to the formal powers. So the one thing that I wanted to make sure that I highlighted in terms of formal powers is the way that the Constitution lays out the role of chief executive. So it says in Article 2, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint officers of the United States. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Much of the president's power comes from this last phrase. So what does it mean to execute the laws? It means basically to administer them, to make sure they're followed, to enforce them. And much of the power of both the president and the executive branch come from that phrase. So what does that mean? Well, execute the laws, which means to enforce them, right? There's federal law enforcement. There always has been federal law enforcement, even before the advent of the FBI. Things like the Secret Service, whose job it was to prevent or to investigate forgery. There are federal courts, so there are federal prosecutors, and those people work for the president. They work for the Department of Justice. So part of this structure of executing the laws comes through the cabinet. Now we're going to talk more about the role of the cabinet as a bureaucracy, as part of the federal agencies in the next lecture. But for this portion, what you should know is the cabinet is originally supposed to be the people who are the president's advisors, right? So initially that was 3 or 4 people, and those cabinet officers clerks, and that was the entire executive branch. But the cabinet is supposed to advise the president. Now it operates more as a sort of larger advisory body, but initially that was the idea, is that those are the people who would help advise the president. This idea of the cabinet and then expansions of the role of the cabinet in other parts of the necessity to ensure the execution of laws has created the need for executive agencies, and those have grown up extensively over time. We'll talk again more about those in the next few lectures. The other piece of the president's power as the chief executive comes through appointments, right? That the president appoints people to serve as their representative or as their trustee. You guys know what that word means. They're trustee in a variety of executive branch functions. So initially, the idea was patronage, right? So the president gets to put into positions of power people who supported him when he ran for office. Well, guess what? Early on, this was almost entirely the post office, right? This was postmasters of every place that had a zip code or any. Sorry, zip codes are a much later development. What I mean here is that every place that had a post office, so a place where mail was delivered and collected, needed a postmaster, and that was all part of the executive branch. The other part that's appointments is the judiciary. So the president gets to appoint, and with the advice and consent of Congress, particularly the Senate, can appoint judges to the federal bench. The other part of this is that the president has the power of reprieve and pardon. Now, the way to think about this is part of the checks and balances, the part of the balance of powers in the system. Why? Well, because think about it. How does this operate? Well, Congress makes the laws, right? Like they make a law that something is criminal, right? That something is not legal to do, right? The court system is the one who judges a citizen to have broken that law and often imposes a penalty. Well, the chief executive, the president, gets to then reprieve that person or pardon that person for their alleged crimes or for the crimes they have been committed of. And so in some ways, it's another part of the checks and balances. It's also a way for the president to be the person who is representing citizens as a whole. So as we think about that idea that the president is a representative of people, as the country as a whole, of citizens across the board, one of the things we can think about is how the president uses their power. And in this case, we can think about the constituencies, the people that the president is communicating with, is making or giving messages to, and is trying to help across the board. And there's a couple different ways I want us to think about this. The first constituency is, of course, the public as a whole, right? The whole nation as a whole, right? In some senses, President Trump has taken this idea one step further with his use of Twitter, so that he is directly communicating with the public all the time. Now, to some degree, each president has a different set of constituencies, and this is similar to what we talked about when we talked about the members of Congress, how they have different constituencies within their districts. So a president has a primary constituency, right? So the people who voted for that person in the primary, or the person who is part of the primary base of their party. And that's going to be people who are more politically sophisticated, so remember, involved, interested, and knowledgeable about politics. But it's also going to tend to be people who are more extreme in one way or another. So the president has to continue to pay attention to those people, particularly if they still need to be reelected. The role in terms of the public is representation, but not in any kind of individual representation. The president doesn't do casework the way members of Congress do. They're not necessarily able to talk as though they are individually representing people, but most of the time, how the president relates to the public as a constituency is to say, right, like, the president is the representative of the whole people, the representative of the nation. In some ways, that head of state role, but more specifically linked to policy. The thing that the president does tend to do as well is to use that idea of national representation as a tool. So in the political science literature, this is called going public. And so there are times when what a president does is largely based on indirect lobbying. He's trying to convince Congress to do something or to act in a particular way or to pursue a particular policy. Well, when a president goes public, he takes that information, he takes that persuasion and argument to the voters and asks the voters, right, to contact their member of Congress, to convince them to, to try to change what public opinion polls say. And in that sense, that's what a president does to foster legislation to move policy. Because remember, while the president does have a large role in determining congressional agenda, he has no direct power. And by the way, I keep using the pronoun he. That is because we've only ever had male presidents. What you can see, though, is that the president's representation varies depending on how people feel about the president at any given time. So these are trends in presidential popularity. And remember, I said this in the earlier video that over time, presidents' popularity tends to decline. Why? Well, because there's all these campaign promises that get made. A president goes into office, and then the expectation gap kicks in. The difference between what a presidential candidate promises and what a president can actually deliver is pretty different. It's pretty steep. And so here is the more recent one from Ford through the first of Obama's terms. And really, generally speaking, that trend holds. Reagan is a little different. His second term is a little different. Clinton is a little different, though. Clinton's popularity is certainly impacted by his impeachment and acquittal. In fact, President Clinton's job approval rating went up over time, even through that period. So, and as you can see, the second President Bush right here got one of the highest percentage approval ratings of all time right after September 11th, 2001. But he dipped low, in fact, just as low as any other president had been. Now, the reality of being president is that the public, the people that you represent, are not your only constituency. And this is one of the interesting challenges to think about when you are looking at or evaluating a president's behavior. Frequently, when a president does something that maybe you as an average voter don't necessarily understand, it's because of one of these other constituencies. So first of all is the electorate, right, in general. So that being everybody who votes. And as we are seeing right now in the debate over what is appropriate ways for us to vote during the middle of a pandemic, who votes matters, right? And so that's another part of the president's constituency. Party voters are important parts of this, but party elites are an even bigger part of an important presidential constituency. And that has to do with a number of things. First of all, the president is the most important fundraiser for their party. They are able to raise more money more quickly than anyone else. So just by having, who doesn't want to have dinner with the president? So we'll all pay $25,000 a plate in order to do that, right? So one of the ways that the president capitalizes on that is by influencing the party elite. And this is, remember, our tri-fold picture of a political party, right? So these are people who are high up in the organization, people who are leadership in Congress, who are elected officials, who hold leadership positions, who are from that party. And so there are times in which the president that's the constituency that they are trying to please. And those kind of things also include just everything else that's going on in the Washington community. So members of Congress, the political media, interest groups and lobbyists, right? That's the inside the Beltway community and constituency that the president actually deals with on a more regular basis, right? Those are the people that are in front of a president on any given day. But they tend to be very different than the population as a whole. I think the last constituency I could have put on here is business, the economy, the stock market, right? Because in that sense, the president, because they are a representative of the country as a whole, is also in the interest of making sure that the economy is running smoothly. So remember that when we looked at the different places that a member of Congress represents in terms of their district, well, they also represent the businesses and the business interest in their district. So you can think about the president in that way too. All right, so those are some more details about how a president operates, how they think about their jobs, how they think about their role inside policymaking. And in the next lecture, we will move on to talk about the executive organization and the cabinet as we move into talking about the federal bureaucracy. But first, you're going to watch a video about Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the people who have used the power of the presidency in one of the most effective, although controversial ways.